Happy Elul 16, everybody. Get ready. All right. What are we going to talk about today? The binding of Isaac, which is called the Akedah. Why are we going to talk about that? Well, that is actually read on the second day of Rosh Hashannah. It's from Genesis 22. So let's get started. I'm going to read from the Humash, okay? And this is the commentary. So you can read along in Genesis 22, but I think you're going to hear a commentary perhaps that you've never heard before, okay? The Akedah binding of Isaac on the altar. This section epitomizes the Jews' determination to serve God no matter how difficult the circumstances, the very reason for Israel's existence. As the commentary will note, this test was especially difficult because Abraham could not rationalize that Isaac deserved to die because he had somehow been found unworthy or that he had become evil. This was decidedly not the case. Isaac's greatness was not only unchallenged, it was ratified by God when he identified Isaac as Abraham's only son, whom he loved. Now, we know he had more than one son, so that's interesting. So let's read more to find out what that means. All right. Implying that Isaac was still worthy of his exalted status. If so, Abraham could have no other justification for taking Isaac's life than unquestioned obedience to God. Wow. Unquestioned obedience to God. Do you have that? Do I have that? That's, wow. Unquestioned obedience. Do we have that in us? That's something we can work on during Teshuvah, is being more obedient. Whether or not he could bring himself to do that was the test. So, God says, take your only son that I gave you to the woman that was over 90 or however old she was, really old. And you're gonna sacrifice him to me. Wow. That's blind obedience. When you know God's talking to you, will you do what he's asking you to do? Will you step out of your fear? Will you step out of yourself and do what he's asking you to do? According to the accepted chronology, Isaac was 37 at the Akedah. Did y'all know that? He was not a baby. He went up willingly. He was 37 years old. Isaac. I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted you guys to hear that because I didn't know that. Okay. The Rabisi teaches that the Akedah took place on Rosh Hashannah. Wow. How about that? So here's something else that's important about Rosh Hashannah. The binding of Isaac took place on Rosh Hashannah. That's crazy. See, these dates and stuff, that always blows my mind. I don't know if it does for you, but God is so perfect. Like, all these times are so planned. There's a perfect time. If you ever hear God's perfect timing? So the binding of Isaac happened on Rosh Hashannah, the day that was the creation of the world, when the creation was done. Okay. For that reason, it is the Torah reading for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and the prayers of that day are filled with the references to this supreme act of devotion to God. In return for Abraham's superhuman dedication to God, I'm glad they called it superhuman, because I'll tell you what, that is superhuman. Like, God telling you to sacrifice your son to me? Would you do that? That's superhuman. You're right. He was given the promise of Jewish survival and triumph that sustains us to this day. So because of that obedience, the remnant of Israel is still here. Superhuman obedience. I want to have superhuman obedience. For a discussion of the concept, we're not going to go into the trial here. Okay, so, all right. that God tested. So it's taking little parts out of the scripture from Genesis 22. Literally, God, the same God who had revealed himself to Abram and had given him Isaac as the culmination of his life's goal, now tested him to see if he would give up his treasured son. So you got to wait. I forget. We did it, yesterday? Was she 90 years old? So they waited, however, when they got married really young. So what'd she wait, like 70, 80 years to have her first kid? And now he is 37. But all right, offer him up to me. What? You made me wait, and then you're going to take him away from me? Okay. Anyway, just trying to think from a mother's point of view, right? This is the only one of Abraham's 10 trials that the Torah explicitly calls a test, because the others were carried to completion as he understood them. Abraham actually left his homeland, sent away Ishmael, and so on. But this one remained nothing more than a test because God did not permit Abraham to slaughter Isaac. So it was never followed through. It was a test. Okay. The Midrash renders in the sense of elevated, like a banner that flies high above an army or a ship. Hence the verse would be rendered, and God exalted Abraham, trial upon trial, greatness after greatness. Abraham could achieve nothing higher, and after these events we do not find God addressing Abraham again, for he had achieved the zenith of his potential, like the highest of highs. Like, I always go back to calculus. How many calculus classes are there? 5, 6, 7? It'd be like, you finally took them all. There's no more calculus classes to take. You know it all. And calculus, I couldn't do that. It's hard. So not only were he passed all his tests, but he was given remember God said, all right, just leave your hometown, take it, move, go. Just leave everybody. How many of y'all could do that? But he was obedient. And that wasn't, that wasn't even the hardest test he was going to have. Okay. Here I am. Such is the answer of the devout, the expression denoting both humility and readiness. Wow. So Abraham said to God, here I am. Here I am, Lord. Use me. We got to say more of that. Please take. Since Abraham was 137 and Isaac was 37, okay, so there was 100 years difference between them. There was no way Abraham could force Isaac to go. Rather, he was to take him by persuasion to do the will of God, the Zohar. That's a whole other story about the Zohar, but yeah, so Isaac did it on his own. Another act of obedience. Like father, like son. God pleaded with Abraham to withstand this test, because otherwise people would say that the earlier sacrifices were without substance. That's from Rashi. Your son. God did not immediately reveal to Abraham the clear identity of the intended offering. The Talmud records the conversation as follows. Okay, so here's the conversation. God said, take your son. Abraham said, but I have 2 sons. Which should I take? Your only one, God said. But each of them is the only son of his mother, whom you love, God answered. But I love them both, said Abraham. I mean Isaac, God replied. There are 2 reasons why God did not say directly, take Isaac. Firstly, he wanted to avoid giving a sudden command, lest Abraham be accused of complying in a state of disoriented confusion. There is also a reason for having him travel for 3 days of reflection before carrying out the injunction. Well, that's interesting. Here we go with the 3 days again. 3 days. Jesus rose in 3 days, right? Additionally, the slow unfolding of the offering's identity was to make the commandment more precious to Abraham by arousing his curiosity and rewarding him for complying with every word of the command. So it took 3 days. Now we know it took Yeshua 3 days. Now God said, I will replace. I will give you the ram. You don't need to use Isaac. So it was a 3-day thing. And what happened with Yeshua? It was a 3-day thing. So Isaac was a picture of the first sacrifice that God didn't use, because he had the real Passover lamb, him, on a cross. But he wanted to see the obedience of Abraham and Isaac, for that matter, that a father would take his son and sacrifice his son for the creator of the universe. Maybe that says something there. I don't know that I would be able to do that, sacrifice my son, if the Lord asked me. And yet, before God came down as man and God sacrificed his son on the cross, Abraham had already been obedient to do it. Now there was no follow through, because it was a test. But it was a test to see if the earthly father would do this for mankind, I guess, for him, for his obedience to God. But I don't know, something to think about there. God saw an earthly father sacrifice his son for him, and then God sacrifices himself for us. Okay, all right. Moriah, Jerusalem. The sages explained that Jerusalem was so named because teaching went forth from it to the world. Ankelos renders to the land of divine service. Apparently, he takes the word Moriah as derived from myrrh, one of the spices of the temple incense mixture, Rashi. Bring him up. God did not say slaughter him, because he did not intend for Isaac to be slaughtered, but only that he be brought up to the mountain and be prepared as a burnt offering. Once Abraham had complied literally and brought him up, God told him not to slaughter Isaac. This resolves the apparent contradiction between God's original command that Isaac be brought as an offering and his later order that he remain unharmed. Abraham had been commanded to bring him up, which he did, but not to actually slaughter him. That's from Rashi. In thinking that he was to slaughter Isaac, Abraham did not misunderstand God's first command, because the general rule is that once an animal is designated as an offering, the entire sacrificial service must be performed. For example, if someone was to sanctify an animal, he could not discharge his obligation merely by placing it on the altar and then taking it down. Only God could tell Abraham that Isaac was to be brought up, but not slaughtered. God chose his words very wisely. What does that say about our words? Choose them wisely. Woke up early and he saddled. Excruciating though it may have been for him, Abraham did not delay. He woke up early in the morning and, ignoring his personal dignity, saddled the donkey personally instead of having it done by a servant. This demonstrates that the zealous hasten to perform the religious duty, which is why it is customary to perform circumcisions early in the morning, if possible, and that the love of God causes one to ignore the normal rules of personal conduct, Sanhedrin 105b. Some have noted as a tribute to Abraham's great presence of mind and equanimity that he was able to sleep that night. Now, interesting enough, too, I'm sure you guys know, again, a donkey was used here. How did Yeshua come down? On Palm Sunday on a donkey, right? So you have these two, like a foreshadow of what was going to happen from Isaac to Yeshua. His two young men, Abraham took Eleazar and Ishmael, who had come to visit him. That was in the Midrash. And he said, I will return to you. Unwittingly, he prophesied that both men would return. So he didn't even realize he said, and I will return to you. Unwittingly, he prophesied both of them would return. Oh, I'm going ahead. I'm sorry. That's why that didn't make sense. And he perceived the place from afar. Abraham saw a cloud hovering over the mountain and recognized it as signifying God's presence. He said, Isaac, my son, do you see what I see? Yes, Isaac said. And Abraham understood that Isaac had the degree of spiritual insight that made him worthy to be an offering. He then turned to the two attendants and asked, do you see what I see? They did not. Noting this, Abraham put them in the same category as his donkey and said, in effect, the donkey sees nothing and you see nothing, therefore stay here with the donkey. And this is where it is. And remember, I'm reading like backwards because the book is opposite. The pages are opposite. And we will return. This is from 22:5. I guess. Yeah. And we will return. The word is in the plural, even though since Abraham planned to sacrifice Isaac, he should have said, and I will return to you. Unwittingly, he prophesied that both men would return. Rashi said that. I love that. Love that prophesying. The prophesying, you don't even know what you're saying half the time, but you're prophesying like he prophesied his son was coming back. And the two of them went together, i.e., in complete harmony. Abraham, who knew that he was going to slay his son, went to the same alacrity as Isaac, who thought he was joining his father in offering an animal. In verse 8, the phase is repeated. By then, Isaac knew that he would be the offering. Yet the two of them still walked together with the same attitude and common purpose, a tribute to them both. But where is the lamb? Until now, Isaac did not know the true purpose of the journey. But as they walked toward the mountain with no animal in sight, he suspected the nature of the test, and he asked his probing question. Abraham answered delicately, God will seek out for himself the lamb. But if there is no lamb, then you, my son, will be the offering. Then Isaac understood. Rashi said this. The much younger Isaac could have resisted or fled easily, but he walked on together with Abraham. He bound Isaac. This is from 22:9. Why did Abraham tie him? And could he bind a 37-year-old man without his consent? Now we know Yeshua was bound with nails, right? Isaac said, Father, I am a vigorous young man, and you are old. I fear that when I see the slaughtering knife in your hand, I will instinctively jerk and possibly injure you. I might also injure myself and thus become unfit as a sacrifice. Or an involuntary movement by me might prevent you from performing the ritual slaughter properly. There was a proper way to do this. Therefore, bind me well, so that at the final moment I will not be deficient in filial honor and respect, and thereby not fulfill the command properly. Thereupon, Abraham immediately bound Isaac, his son. That's from the Midrash. 22:10, and he took the knife. The sages depict movingly the intensity of the emotion that enveloped the participants. Abraham felt a mixture of joy in fulfilling God's will, but also sadness that his beloved son was about to die. As he reached for the knife, tears streamed from his eyes and fell into Isaac's. Oh, sheesh. Yet he rejoiced to do God's will. That's from the Midrash. Abraham looked at Isaac, and Isaac looked up at the angels on high. Isaac saw them, but Abraham did not. That's from the Targum Yonasan. The angels wept too, as it were, with their tears fell into Isaac's eyes. That's from Rashi to 27:1. The angels appealed, Master of the universe, was Abraham not hospitable to strangers, and did he not lead them into your service by proclaiming you as a source of all blessing? Did not Sarah's menses return in Abraham's merit that she might give birth to Isaac? Will the promises made to Abraham regarding his offspring now be broken? Lo, the knife is at his throat. How long will you wait? These are the angels talking to God on behalf of Isaac, pleading with God not to kill Isaac. This is from 22:11. Abraham, Abraham! The repetition of the name expressed love. That's what Rashi says, and urgency from the Midrash. And Abraham raised his eyes to see if there was an animal he could offer in place of Isaac. Abraham wanted to dedicate the lives of all his descendants just as he had been ready to offer the life of his son. The binding of Isaac represents total submission to God's will. Now Abraham sought to make the dedication eternal by bringing an offering in Isaac's place. Thus, the daily temple offerings were a national continuation of the Akedah. After the preceding events, when the angel had told Abraham not to harm the lad, he saw a ram caught in the thicket. This is where the ram's horns, right? It says, Shem will see. The original name of the place was Shalem, the name given by Shem, son of Noah, whom the sages identify with Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem. After the Akedah, Abraham called in Yari. In deference to both Shem and Abraham, God synthesized both names and called it Yerushalayim. That's from the Midrash. A second time, having sacrificed the ram and named the mountain, Abraham had turned this epochal event into the standard of behavior for his descendants. Only then did the angel reappear to announce the great blessing that lay in store. This is 22:16. By myself I swear, just as I am eternal, so my oath is eternal. God had already promised Abraham that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars in the dust. Now he assured Abraham that they would prevail over their enemies. Thus, even they were to sin grievously, they would never be completely destroyed or fall into the hands of their enemies permanently. Accordingly, this solemn assurance of Israel's ultimate redemption. Like the stars of the heavens, when Israel complies with God's will, they resemble the stars of the heaven, then no nation can dominate them. But when they flout his will, they resemble the sands of the seashore, trampled by every tyrannical foot. Obedience. Obedience to God. I want to have the kind of obedience that Abraham had, that his son Isaac had. I don't know that I'll ever get to that, but I pray that I'm worthy. That I'm worthy to be able to do this. To be obedient to the very end, to finish the race, to never flounder. Well, that's the end of this one. Long video, but I wanted to read you that stuff. There's some pretty cool stuff that's in the Humash. Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, bye. Love y'all.